Lilith seems to be the main antagonist for the plot of Diablo IV, and for the most part she is. She is the active character who creates the situations we need to react to, for the most part. But there is evidence to suggest that Mephisto, her father, isn't merely acting in his own self-interests to defend himself. Rather, he has planned for this on a greater scale, more than it would appear at first glance, making sure the events play out in a certain way so that it can actually benefit him. And this is something Neyrelle herself senses at the end of the game, beginning to suspect that it is Mephisto who is the real enemy. He isn't defenseless. Mephisto is well regarded to be the most intelligent and calculating of the three primes, and we shouldn't imagine that the Lord of Hatred has sat back and done nothing to turn the current events to his own advantage, and in fact, there are more than a few clues that he has. So in this lore video we will examine the pieces of evidence that imply Mephisto has a greater hand in how the story plays out and what he seeks to achieve. But before we get started guys, remember that if you like Diablo IV lore, then consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. So later on in the game, Mephisto quite often reminds us that he saved us, as early on in the game we do find ourselves without a horse, stranded in the snow, and on the verge of freezing to death in a cave. After wolves savage our horse, Mephisto in his wolf visage seems to somehow revive us, and we do get back on our feet full of vigour. However, there is a detail to this scenario that I only noticed on a repeat playthrough, and that detail is that it isn't just a random wolf or warg that savages our horse that leads us to become stranded. It is Mephisto himself. There is a moment when you see the wolf responsible for killing our horse watching us through the trees. If you freeze the frame, you can see that the profile of this wolf matches the skeletal skull of Mephisto's wolf form, meaning he saved us from a situation he created himself. He wanted us here. Had he left our horse unmolested, we would have continued on our journey to places unknown. Instead, because of his meddling, we end up in Nevesk, we end up being poisoned by Lilith's blood, and we end up set on a path for a collision with his daughter Lilith, and ultimately, we kill her. Because of this simple act by Mephisto, by murdering our horse, he lays the foundations for our entire journey, and ultimately, Lilith's demise. It's almost as if he knew, and yet this is before we even ingest Lilith's petals, before we have any connection to her. Before that even happens, Mephisto is planning to have us undertake the journey that we end up doing. That is the power of Mephisto. Before the game even starts, before we even meet Lilith or hear of her, Mephisto has set in motion the first domino to fall that will cause a chain of events that will lead to her death. With this level of foresight in mind, it's hard to imagine him being surprised at all by any of the events that happen hereafter. And while he may be weakened, he was never defenseless against his daughter's predations, and has been planning to manipulate events in his favour. This more easily explains why Mephisto helps us throughout the entire game. He didn't just happen upon us, he chose us. What is also interesting, and something that greatly bothered me throughout my playthrough, was how easily the cult of the Triune falls to Lilith. For those who are unaware, the Mother's Chosen cult of Lilith throughout the game was once the Temple of Triune that has been converted to Lilith's cause. The Temple of the Triune being the ancient cult that worships the three primevals, Diablo, Mephisto and Baal. Admittedly, the Triune hasn't been a force in Sanctuary for years, so Lilith could easily reform it in her image, and yes, the primes have been greatly weakened since the events of Diablo 2 and 3, with their souls being imprisoned and then dispersed. Yet with all that said, it was hard to accept that the intelligent minds of the likes of Diablo and Mephisto in particular would let Lilith take over their influence, or at least permit her without any sort of resistance. And yet, at the end of the game, there is a hint that Mephisto hasn't just let this cult be taken over, and despite appearances, he very much still has a hold over it. And this is thanks to a small dialogue that happens during the sack of Caldeum. When you approach some of the Mother's Chosen cult, one of them says the following: "The rain of blood, the sign we've waited for." And then another says, "As the Lord of Hatred said, our time is now. Cull the weak." At which point they use their prisoners to summon more demons, and we have to kill them. After this battle, our heroes are dumbstruck by what they heard, and say the following:
They mentioned the Lord of Hatred.
Mephisto.
What? That can't be. Elias owned this cult, and Lilith owned him.
So this little subtle dialogue makes the suggestion that right under the very nose of Lilith, some of her own followers actually still follow the directions of the prime evil Mephisto. Moreover, it suggests that he has been communicating with them somehow. It also tells us something else. Mephisto is aware of this same prophecy, and clearly has planned around it, telling his followers to watch out for the signs. Mephisto's plans are far-reaching, subtle, and well planned. And yet his followers don't act until now, meaning he is essentially happy for his daughter's plans to advance as they are. Again, he has foreseen this, and he is happy to let it play out the way Lilith wants, to make her think that she is winning, so that she is led right into the jaws of the final trap. He has foreseen this, and he is ready for it, only by subtly modifying it here and there, by introducing us into the mix. After hearing this exchange between the cultists, Neyrelle does start to have suspicions about Mephisto, that he is the real enemy behind all of the events, and that he is the bigger threat than Lilith.
It is the only way to guarantee Lilith's defeat.
No, not Lilith. You're all wrong about that. The stone should be saved for Mephisto, her maker, the prime evil. You know his powers of manipulation. His hatred has already poisoned us. Even Lilith fears him. Why don't you?
Indeed, at this point in the game, I was getting a similar feeling, that something wasn't right. Mephisto seems far too calm about his apparent imminent demise, that he isn't just defending himself and working with us to make sure he survives, that this is all playing out exactly how he wanted. Let us return to the cultists who speak Mephisto's name and what their actions are. They say cull the weak, then sacrifice people, bringing more demons into the world and essentially perpetuating the violence that is happening in Caldeum. There's also the question of the blood rain. Where on earth does it come from? Does Mephisto actually summon this rain so he can signal his sleeper cells that the time has come? Does Mephisto literally make part of the prophecy come true? As far as I see it, he is one of the only beings who could be capable of creating such a phenomena. I believe whether or not he creates it, this is Mephisto's sign to his embedded followers that they are to take control of the cult back from Lilith, now that their role in getting Lilith to where he wants is finished. Mephisto knows that his daughter's end is near, and it's time for him to take back control of his cult. At the end of our journey, at the end of the game, the state of affairs is this: Lilith is dead, Inarius is dead, and the cult is back in Mephisto's control. And Mephisto has gained a free ride out of hell, courtesy of Neyrelle and the Soul Stone. Indeed, when we approach Mephisto with the Soul Stone, he doesn't seem that bothered at the prospect of being imprisoned. He kind of lazily protests, as if to bait Neyrelle into going through with it, before cryptically saying, This raises questions about the Soul Stone itself. Did he somehow influence Lilith to search for Astaroth, knowing that after all the bloodshed there would be a free soulstone for the heroes to use to get Mephisto out of hell. Was the information somehow fed back to her via the cult that he was actually controlling? Astaroth himself doesn't seem too bothered that he is betraying his lord, the Master of Hatred. Perhaps he too is playing a role coached by Mephisto. Then to finish off, Mephisto dutifully pads through a portal in wolf form and helps spirit Neyrelle away with his soulstone. Yes, he obviously doesn't want Lilith catching him in his weakened soulstone position, but there is something unsettling about his calm, about his serene silence. He doesn't rage, he doesn't shout, he doesn't curse, he just quietly goes along with it despite being a primeval that has just been imprisoned. It's too quiet, and as we put his daughter down, the only person who stands to benefit from the aftermath of this story is Mephisto. His enemies have all been obliterated without him lifting a finger himself. And one image that has stuck in my mind is the image of Lilith's body crumbling to ash, and as it falls to the ground, the camera is fixed on the statue of Mephisto, standing triumphantly over his daughter's remains. So I believe that Mephisto always expected things to go this way, and he planned for it, and made it work out for his advantage. He introduced us into the mix so that we would eventually confront and kill his daughter, another of his enemies. I believe he also expected to be imprisoned in the Soulstone. He expected it. He protests about it at the end, but I believe that's what he really wanted. His cult is ready for him. We are not. And Neyrelle can surely only resist his influence for so long. A point that was made to me in my Story Explained video by a commenter Makuta Furka X is that the primevals know very well how to corrupt soulstones, and we learn this in Diablo II, where thanks to the fallen angel Izul, the primevals learned the secret of the soulstones and how to corrupt them. And so again, this reinforces the idea that it's very believable that Mephisto wanted to be imprisoned in a soulstone, seeing it as a form of temporary transportation out of hell. And again, shout out to Makuta Furka X for making that comment. How the rest of his plans will pan out remains to be seen, but be in no doubt, the Lord of Hatred hasn't just played things to his advantage as they have happened. He has long planned for this, and we are but a pawn on his chessboard. Well, thanks guys, that is my take on how Mephisto has had a hand in the events that play out in Diablo 4's story. If you liked this video, then please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel, as more Diablo 4 content will be coming. But let me know your thoughts on Mephisto's involvement. Do you think he truly intended to be imprisoned by the Soulstone like I do? Or do you believe he didn't plan for that? Either way, let me know in the comments below what you're looking forward to in the coming expansions. But until next time guys, I will see you in the circles of hell. Take care and have a wonderful night.